The first time I noticed something was off, I didn't think much about it. Working as a ranch hand on a sprawling cattle ranch in rural South Texas, you get used to strange noises and odd happenings. The wind sweeping across the plains can play tricks on your ears, and the long, hot days under the scorching sun can make your eyes see things that aren't there. For the sake of this story, you can call me Miguel. I'd been working at the ranch, one that will remain unnamed for a couple of years by then. It's tough work, but honest, the kind that has me up before dawn, saddling my horse and heading out to check on the herd. We manage around 500 head of cattle on a huge stretch of scrubland and mesquite. It's beautiful, but harsh terrain. The kind of place where you always keep one eye on the horizon for storms or dust devils. The first strange event happened in late April, just as the bluebonnets began to fade and the heat of summer crept in. I was out near the eastern fence line, fixing a section that had come loose after a recent windstorm. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in warm oranges and purples. As I worked, I started to feel uneasy. It sounds like a cliché, but I felt like I was being watched. I glanced around, half expecting to see a coyote or maybe a mountain lion in the brush. But there was nothing, just the distant sounds of cattle lowing and the wind rustling through the mesquite. I shook it off and got back to work, but the feeling grew stronger as the sun set. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could swear I heard something moving in the tall grass just beyond the fence line. Something big. I called out, thinking it might be one of the other hands trying to scare me. "Hey, who's out there?" I yelled, trying to mask the nervousness in my voice. There was no answer, just more rustling. It was closer now. Then a smell hit me. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled before, a mixture of wet dog, rotting meat, and something otherworldly. I didn't stick around to investigate. I gathered my tools and bolted back to my truck, my heart racing. As I drove back to the bunkhouse, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me down the road. When I got back, I didn't mention anything to the other hands. Most of them already thought I was soft for being from the city, and I didn't want to give them more reasons to tease me. That night, as I lay in my bunk listening to the snores of the other hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there had been watching me. But with no proof, I pushed it to the back of my mind. Life on the ranch kept me busy, and a few uneventful weeks went by. Then, in early June, things started to get strange again. Pedro, one of the older hands who'd been working cattle longer than I'd been alive, was the first to notice something wrong with the herd. One morning at breakfast, he mentioned how the cattle seemed spooked, more skittish than usual. "They know something we don't," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Animals can sense things." I didn't think much of it at the time, but over the next few days I started to see it too. The cattle were clustering together more tightly, even in the heat of the day, and they were quieter, like they were trying not to draw attention to themselves. Then, the attacks started. At first, it was just a calf here and there. We'd find them in the morning, weak and listless, with strange puncture wounds on their necks. Mr. Hawkins, the ranch owner, assumed it was coyotes or maybe a mountain lion. He had us start patrolling at night, rifles in hand. But after a week of nightly rides with no sign of predators, things got stranger. One night, I was patrolling with Jake, another hand. We were riding along the southern pasture under a low-hanging moon. The air was still, unnaturally quiet. Our horses were on edge, their ears flicking nervously. Then, Jake's horse reared up, almost throwing him off. As he struggled to calm the animal, I saw something move in the shadows about 50 yards away. It was big, bigger than a dog, but the shape was all wrong. It seemed to be hairless, with a long snout and powerful hind legs. Before I could get a better look, it disappeared into the dark, as if it had never been there. Jake hadn't seen it. He was too busy calming his horse. When I described what I'd seen, he looked at me like I was crazy. "You've been listening to too many of Pedro's stories," he joked, though I could tell he was just as spooked as I was. The next morning, we found 3 more calves attacked. This time the wounds were worse, like something had tried to drain them dry. Mr. Hawkins called the local game warden, but they were just as baffled as we were. That's when the whispers started. At first, it was just Pedro, muttering about El Chupacabra when he thought no one was listening. But soon, the other hands started talking too, though none of them would admit they believed in such things. Still, you could see the fear in their eyes. I didn't want to believe it either. Chupacabras were just stories, right? Something made up to scare kids or sell tabloids. But with each passing day, as more animals were attacked and strange occurrences kept happening, it got harder to deny that something unnatural was at play. One night, about 2 weeks into the attacks, I was jolted awake by a commotion outside the bunkhouse. I grabbed my boots and ran out along with the other hands. What we saw stopped us in our tracks. The entire herd, hundreds of cattle, was pressed up against the corral fences as far from the open pastures as they could get. They were bellowing in terror, their eyes rolling wildly. And there, just at the edge of our floodlights, was a shape. It was the same thing I had seen before, but now I could see it more clearly. It was roughly humanoid, hunched over like some kind of primitive ape. Its skin was a mottled gray-green, and its eyes reflected the light like a cat's. For a moment, it just stood there, watching us. Then, it let out a shriek, a terrible sound, like a mountain lion mixed with a woman screaming, and vanished into the night. After that night, things escalated. We lost more cattle every night, despite our best efforts to protect them. Mr. Hawkins brought in veterinarians, wildlife biologists, even a couple of paranormal investigators. But no one could explain what was happening. The atmosphere on the ranch grew tense, and some of the hands quit, unwilling to deal with whatever was lurking out there. Those of us who stayed started carrying loaded weapons at all times, even during the day. We set up trail cameras all over the property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature. But despite our efforts, nothing solid came to light. Eventually, Mr. Hawkins made the decision to sell the ranch. The night before the new owners arrived, I had my final encounter. I was doing one last patrol, more out of habit than hope. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the darkness felt oppressive. As I rode past the old barn, I heard a sound, a low, guttural growl that made my horse stop in its tracks. My hand went to my rifle, but before I could raise it, something lunged at me from the shadows. I only caught a glimpse, gray-green skin, glowing red eyes, wicked claws, before my horse reared up and threw me to the ground. I hit the dirt hard, the air knocked from my lungs. I could hear the creature circling me, its breathing heavy and ragged. I thought I was about to die. But just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, bounding away into the night. I don't remember how I made it back to the bunkhouse, but I did. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. I wasn't sticking around to find out what happened next. I moved on, taking up construction work in San Antonio. But I still think back to that creature, those red eyes, and wonder what might have happened if I hadn't made it out alive. the chupacabra of southern Texas. The first time I noticed something was off, I didn't think much of it. Working as a ranch hand on a sprawling cattle ranch in rural South Texas, you get used to weird noises and unexplained happenings. The wind howling across the plains can play tricks on your ears, and the long hours under the scorching sun can make your eyes see things that aren't there. For the purpose of this story, you can call me Miguel. I had been working at a certain ranch, one that will go unnamed, for a couple of years. The work was hard, but it was honest. Most mornings I was up before dawn, saddling my horse and heading out to check the herd. We ran about 500 head of cattle across a massive stretch of scrubland and mesquite trees. The country was beautiful, but it could be unforgiving, the kind of place where you always keep one eye on the horizon, watching for dust devils or summer storms rolling in. The first incident happened in late April, just as the bluebonnets were beginning to fade and the real heat of summer started creeping in. I was near the eastern fence line, fixing a section that had come loose after a recent windstorm. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and purples. As I worked, an uneasy feeling crept over me. It sounds like a cliché, but I felt like I was being watched. I started looking around, half expecting to spot a coyote or a mountain lion eyeing me from the brush. But there was nothing. Just the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance and the rustling of the wind through the mesquite. I shook it off and returned to my work. As it got later, that strange feeling only grew stronger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could have sworn I heard something moving through the tall grass just beyond the fence line, something big. I called out, thinking it might be one of the other hands trying to play a prank on me. "Hey, who's out there?" I shouted, my voice betraying just a hint of nervousness. No response, just more rustling, and it was getting closer. Then, out of nowhere, an awful smell hit me, a stench unlike anything I'd ever smelled before. It was a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I couldn't quite place, something alien. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I quickly gathered my tools and hightailed it back to my truck, heart pounding the whole way. As I drove back to the bunkhouse, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me down the road. When I got back, I didn't mention it to the other hands. They already thought I was soft, being from the city originally. No need to give them more ammo. But that night, lying in my bunk, listening to the chorus of snores around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there had been watching me, sizing me up. The next few weeks passed without incident. The spring roundup kept us all busy from sunup to sundown, and I pushed that strange encounter to the back of my mind. But in early June, things started getting weird again. It was Pedro who first noticed something was off with the herd. Pedro had been working cattle longer than I'd been alive, and he had an almost supernatural sense for when something wasn't right. One morning at breakfast, he casually mentioned that the cattle seemed spooked, more skittish than usual. "They know something we don't," he muttered, his weathered face creased with concern. "Animals can sense things." At the time, I didn't think much of it. But over the next few days, I started noticing it too. The cattle were clustering together more than usual, even in the heat of the day, and they were quiet, eerily so. It was as if they were trying not to draw attention to themselves. Then the attacks started. At first, it was just a calf here and there. We'd find them in the morning, weak and listless, with strange puncture wounds on their necks. Mr. Hawkins, the ranch owner, figured it was coyotes or maybe a mountain lion. He had us start patrolling the fence lines at night, taking shifts with rifles in hand. But then things got stranger. I was on patrol with Jake, another ranch hand, about a week after the attacks began. We were riding along the southern pasture, the moon low in the sky, and everything was unnervingly quiet. Even our horses were on edge, their ears flicking nervously at every little sound. Suddenly, Jake's horse reared up, nearly throwing him to the ground. While he struggled to control the animal, I saw something moving in the shadows about 50 yards away. It was big, bigger than a dog, but the shape was all wrong. It looked hairless, with a long snout and powerful hind legs. Before I could get a better look, it melted into the darkness like a nightmare, disappearing with the dawn. Jake hadn't seen it. He was too busy calming his horse. When I told him what I'd seen, he gave me a look like I was crazy. "You've been listening to too many of Pedro's stories," he said with a nervous laugh. But I could tell he was spooked too. The next morning, we found 3 more calves dead. The wounds were worse this time, as if something had tried to drain them dry. Mr. Hawkins called the local game warden, but they were as baffled as we were. That's when the whispers began. At first, it was just Pedro muttering about El Chupacabra when he thought no one was listening. But soon, the other ranch hands were talking too. Most of them were too macho to admit they believed in such things. But you could see the fear in their eyes. I didn't want to believe it. Chupacabras were just stories, right? Something made up to scare kids and sell tabloids. But with each passing day, as more animals were attacked and strange things kept happening around the ranch, it became harder to deny that something unnatural was going on. About 2 weeks into the attacks, I was woken up in the middle of the night by a commotion outside the bunkhouse. I grabbed my boots and ran out, along with the other hands. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. The entire herd, hundreds of cattle, were pressed up against the corral fences, as far from the open pastures as they could get. They were bellowing in terror, their eyes wide and rolling. And there, just at the edge of our floodlights, was a shape. It was the same thing I'd seen before, that dog-like figure, but now I could see it more clearly. It was roughly humanoid, hunched over like some kind of primitive ape. Its skin was a mottled gray-green, and its eyes reflected the light like a cat's. For a moment, it just stood there, watching us. Then it let out a shriek, a bone-chilling scream that sounded like a mix between a mountain lion and a woman in agony, before vanishing into the night. After that, things escalated quickly. We lost more cattle every night, no matter what we did to protect them. Mr. Hawkins brought in experts, veterinarians, wildlife biologists, even a couple of paranormal investigators, but no one could explain what was happening. The atmosphere at the ranch grew tense, and some of the hands quit, unwilling to deal with whatever was out there. Those of us who stayed began carrying loaded weapons at all times, even during the day. We set up trail cameras all over the property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature, but nothing ever showed up. Eventually, Mr. Hawkins decided to sell the ranch. I wasn't surprised. Whatever was happening out there wasn't natural, and it was only getting worse. The night before the new owners were set to arrive, I had my closest encounter yet. I was doing a final patrol of the property, more out of habit than any real hope of stopping the attacks. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and it was dark, darker than usual. I was on edge as I rode past the old barn, and that's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My hand went to my rifle, but before I could raise it, something leapt out of the shadows. I caught a glimpse of gray-green skin, glowing red eyes, and wickedly curved claws before my horse reared up and threw me to the ground. I hit the dirt hard, the air knocked out of me. As I gasped for breath, I heard something circling me, its heavy breathing ragged and labored. I thought I was about to meet my end. But just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone, bounding away into the night. I don't remember how I made it back to the bunkhouse that night, but I did. The next morning, the new owners arrived, and I handed in my resignation. With the change in ownership and the increasingly dangerous events around the ranch, I didn't feel comfortable staying any longer. I moved on to work construction in San Antonio, but I still get chills thinking back on those glowing red eyes and the feeling of being hunted by something I couldn't explain. That's the story. A chilling reminder that sometimes, out in the dark places of the world, there are things that defy explanation. Whether you believe in El Chupacabra or not, something out there was hunting those cattle, and maybe even me. Small Town Mysteries. I'm Russian, with Romanian and German heritage. From the ages of 1 to 12, I lived in Russia with my mom and stepdad. When I was around 5 or 6, my mom, who was single and overworked, sent me off to a small, isolated town to live with my grandmother. She was happy to take care of me, and for the first few months, everything seemed peaceful. My grandmother enrolled me in a local daycare while she worked at a school for disabled children. Life followed a simple routine, but one particular day stands out vividly in my memory. A foggy morning with damp air and gray skies. My grandmother woke me around 9 a.m. to drop me off at daycare, and the day passed uneventfully until around 3 p.m. A storm began brewing. Rain pattering on the roof, the occasional flash of lightning and rumbles of thunder. Most of the kids at daycare were scared, hiding under tables, but I was always a brave, or perhaps foolish, child. While the power went out and the room was dimly lit by lanterns and candles, I asked one of the supervisors to tell us ghost stories. The stories she told were typical. Tales about kind ghosts or mysterious creatures in the forest. But there was one story she shared that chilled me. It was about a lone hiker who wandered into our village, only to stumble out of the nearby woods babbling about strange creatures in the ponds and giant dogs. The way she told it was unlike the others. Her voice grew soft, her eyes distant, as if recalling a memory rather than spinning a yarn. At that moment, lightning flashed outside, illuminating the surrounding area for a brief second. I glanced out the window, which faced the forest several miles away. And that's when I saw it. It causes me physical pain to describe what I saw, but I'll try. Standing in the distance was a creature, something tall, impossibly tall, a horrifying mixture of werewolf and deer. But what struck me most was that it had no eyes, just dark, gaping holes. It stood motionless, and though it had no eyes, I felt it was staring right at me. I was frozen with fear. Just as I was about to point it out to the supervisor, the creature vanished. Struggling to find my voice, I asked her, "Miss K, that story about the hiker, what kind of big dog did he see, like a husky?" Miss K's face paled. She whispered in a raspy voice, "Don't ask questions, dear. It doesn't like people poking around." She gave a quick glance out the window and shuddered. The other kids had already returned to playing, and the power had come back on. Everything seemed back to normal, except for me. Later that day, my grandmother came to pick me up, and as we sat at home drinking tea, I couldn't shake what I had seen. I cautiously brought up the topic. "Granny, have you ever heard of a hiker in our town?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, when I was young, I worked at a local bar. One evening, a man came in, an outsider. His Russian wasn't very good, but he seemed troubled. He clutched my hands and started talking about large dogs with no eyes. I thought he was mad or maybe drunk. It was a strange day." Her calm tone didn't match the rising fear I felt. I looked out the window, half expecting to see the creature staring back at me again. Several years passed, and by the time I was 10, the memories of that creature had faded into the background. For my 10th birthday, I convinced my friends Lucy and Emily to join me for a camping trip in the same forest near my old daycare. My grandmother approved, and we eagerly set off, hiking through the woods, picking flowers and climbing trees. As the sun set, we found a small clearing and set up camp. We roasted food over a makeshift fire, laughed, and gossiped about boys. But as the last traces of daylight disappeared, I felt a sudden chill. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I urged my friends to go inside the tent, but they laughed it off, teasing me for being scared. We extinguished the fire and zipped ourselves into the tent. However, sleep didn't come easily. About an hour later, I heard a sound, a howl, but it was wrong. It was like a scream and a howl combined, and the scream sounded eerily human. I shook Emily awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, wide-eyed. "Yeah, but what is it?" she asked. "Maybe a wolf," I suggested, trying to comfort myself. "No," she whispered. "Wolves don't scream like little girls." Then Emily froze, her hand shaking as she pointed behind me. I turned and saw a shadow on the tent wall, a shape that looked all too familiar. It was the same creature from years ago, the one with no eyes. The unearthly howling continued, louder now, just outside our tent. Neither Emily nor I slept that night. We lay there in terror, listening to the creature until dawn finally broke. The moment daylight came, we packed up and ran out of those woods, never looking back. Since that day, I've been haunted by memories of that creature. I used to get migraines, accompanied by the sound of that terrifying howl. And in my dreams, I still see it staring at me with its hollow, eyeless face. Eventually, I moved far away from that village, all the way to Canada, hoping to leave those dark memories behind. But even now, they linger, reminding me of the horrors that sometimes dwell in small, quiet places. Those memories of the Russian woods and that eyeless creature are etched in my mind forever. Some mysteries can never be explained, and perhaps it's better that way. The Return of the Not Deer. It's been over a year and a half since I first came face to face with the not deer in the woods behind my house in Alabama. To be honest, I thought that after our terrifying encounter, the creature would leave me alone for good. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. For those who don't know, I'm Sean M., and I'm a senior in high school, living in rural Alabama with my parents. Our house is isolated, surrounded by dense woods on all sides, except for a small path that leads to town. A year and a half ago, I encountered a creature I now believe to be a wendigo, though I've always called it the knot deer. It first appeared when I was out hunting one night. I mistook it for a deer and shot at it, only for it to chase me through the woods, stalking me even after I made it back to my house. The creature has the ability to mimic voices perfectly and disguise itself as a large buck, but it's far more terrifying than any ordinary deer. Since that night, it has haunted me, lurking on the edges of my life and tormenting me from the shadows. I thought it was over. I thought it had left, but I was a fool to believe that. It came back. It was another hunting trip, just like the one from before. I was deep in the woods, wearing my dad's old ghillie suit, blending into the landscape. I had been out there for nearly 5 hours. The sun had set, and the only light came from the moon overhead. The forest, so full of life a moment ago, suddenly fell silent. Every animal, every insect, gone. It was the kind of silence that fills you with dread, and I knew that something was wrong. A few moments later, a black bear appeared in front of me. It was limping, clearly injured, with blood dripping from its paw. I lay completely still, watching the bear lick its wound. Soon, a bear cub emerged from the brush, making its way toward its mother. It was a rare and touching scene, and I lowered my rifle, deciding not to shoot. But my peace was short-lived. Out of nowhere, a blur of movement struck. Something pounced on the baby bear, dragging it into the trees with a horrible scream. The mother bear roared in fury and charged after it, but she was thrown back by an unseen force. Her cub's cries were silenced in an instant, and before I could even process what was happening, the attacker stepped into the light. It was the knot deer. I'll never forget what that thing looked like. It had the shape of a deer, but its body was grotesque, emaciated, with ribs protruding through its fur. Its eyes were milky white, almost like it was blind, and its mouth was filled with sharp, carnivorous teeth. Worse still, its front legs ended in long, razor-sharp claws, more like human hands than hooves. Its face was partially skinned, revealing white bone beneath its flesh. It was smeared with fresh and dried blood, some of it from the bear, some of it who knows what. It stood over the mother bear, attacking her with the same brutality it had shown to her cub. The sounds of the bear's cries echoed through the trees, mixing with the screeches of the knot deer. It wasn't just hunting, it was killing for sport, tearing them apart for no reason other than cruelty. I watched, frozen in terror, as the creature finished its slaughter. Blood was everywhere. I felt sick to my core. The knot deer just stood there, motionless, staring at its handiwork. I don't know what possessed me, but I lifted my rifle and aimed at its head. Last time, I had shot it in the heart, and it hadn't even flinched. This time, I wasn't taking any chances. I pulled the trigger. The bullet bounced off its skull. The creature turned toward me, its eyes locking onto mine, as if it had known I was there the whole time. Its gaze froze me in place, but somehow, I managed to gather the strength to run. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, the sound of its screeches following me as it gave chase. I could feel it closing in, almost touching me, but I kept running, knowing that if it caught me, I was dead. I burst through the door of my house and slammed it shut behind me. I grabbed my handgun and shoved the living room couch in front of the door, hoping it would hold. My parents were out of town, and I was all alone. The creature paced outside, its footsteps heavy on the porch. Then, I heard a voice. My mother's voice. "We're home. Let us in." It was the not deer, mimicking her voice. I stayed silent, gripping my gun tighter. Then my father's voice joined in. "Open the door, son. Let us in." The voices blended together, repeating the same phrase over and over again. It was like a twisted demonic chant, trying to lure me into opening the door. But I knew better. I'd heard its tricks before. Eventually, the voices stopped. I didn't sleep that night, lying awake on the floor with my gun, listening for any sign of the creature's return. When morning came, I woke to find the door scratched. 5 jagged lines carved into the wood where the not deer had tried to claw its way in. It hadn't broken through, but it had come close. Too close. For the next 3 days, I didn't leave the house. I didn't even dare look out the windows. When I finally stepped outside, I found a gruesome gift waiting for me in the yard. The severed head of a young bear, left there as a warning. Since then, things have only gotten worse. The not deer keeps showing up, watching me from a distance. It doesn't move. It just stands there, waiting. My life has spiraled out of control. My girlfriend broke up with me. I'm failing my classes, and I'm losing my friends. Every time I see the not deer, something else falls apart. I don't know what it wants from me. Maybe it's trying to drive me mad, or maybe it's waiting for the right moment to strike. Either way, it's not going to stop, and I don't know how much longer I can keep running from it.